By the 1920s, Alfred Marshall's principles of economics had superseded John Stuart Mill's principles of political economy as the primary textbook in the economics discipline. The widespread adoption of Marshall's work marks the displacement of Adam Smith and David Ricardo's classical school of economics by the neoclassical school, which found its first expression in the marginalist economists of the 1870s. One of Marshall's gifts to economics is its signature supply-demand curves. His curves beautifully illustrate how the laws of supply and demand, embodied in their respective intersecting curves, form a relation which gives way to an equilibrium price. One of the early critics of these so-called Marshallian scissors was Italian economist Piero Sraffa. In 1925 and 1926, Sraffa published a set of articles critiquing the assumptions behind Marshall's theory of supply. In particular, he argues that Marshall's depiction of long-run industry supply curves is inconsistent with both perfect competition and the partial equilibrium method. Sraffa's critique of Marshall is the topic of Gary Mongiovi's article reviewing their controversy, which we will be discussing today. Marshall's view of an industry supply curve is that it matches the industry's cost curve. If costs increase with quantity, returns are diminishing and the supply curve is upward sloping. If costs decrease with quantity, returns are increasing and the supply curve is downward sloping. Only when costs are quantity invariant do returns stay constant, leaving the supply curve perfectly horizontal. So in sum, there are three supply curves which Marshall thought to be possible in a competitive industry: upward sloping, increasing costs; downward sloping, decreasing costs; and horizontal or constant costs. Sraffa argues that the first two of these are inconsistent with the assumptions of Marshall's theory. In his view, only the third case, constant costs, is possible for a competitive industry in neoclassical theory. First, let us address Sraffa's objection to upward sloping supply curves. A competitive industry with an upward sloping supply curve is one with increasing costs and hence decreasing returns to scale. Sraffa argues that the notion of increasing costs is not consistent with Marshall's notion of competition. The Marshallian depiction of perfect competition assumes that there are an infinite number of identical firms. If each firm is itself too small to have any effect on prices, it does not make sense to say that the amalgamated decisions of all firms can have an effect on prices. After all, the sum of many zeros is still zero. Suppose we ignore this complication and assume that it were indeed possible for the industry supply curve to be upward sloping. We would still be in violation of a necessary assumption of Marshallian partial equilibrium theory, that the costs of all other industries be held constant. If there are increasing costs in the industry which we are considering, costs will also be increasing in all other industries which share its inputs. Changes in the input costs of other industries will modify their prices, creating knockoff effects which make partial equilibrium analysis untenable. Say, for example, increases in wheat production bid up the price of its input, coal. Any industry which utilizes coal, say, for example, pigs, will face new input costs as a result. If pigs are used in the production of wheat, or any commodity, which is an input into wheat production, for that matter, then changes in the costs of pigs will affect the price of wheat. We might attempt to get around this issue by postulating the following condition. No changes in input costs that happen as the result of expanding production in a given industry affect the prices of commodities, which themselves enter into the production of that given commodity. In other words, industries with decreasing returns do not create inputs for each other. This condition, it does actually save Marshall's theory from Sraffa's criticism, at least in principle. However, the principle is quite weak. A situation where industries with decreasing returns do not interact is highly unlikely. Now that we have addressed Sraffa's objection to upward sloping supply curves, let us address his objection to downward sloping ones. A competitive industry with a downward sloping supply curve is one with decreasing costs and hence increasing returns to scale. This sort of industry, too, it's inconsistent with the axioms of Marshall's theory. If there are increasing returns to scale, the first firm to expand would have a cost advantage and would be able to absorb the entire market, thereby turning the industry from a perfectly competitive one into a monopoly, or at the very least, an industry which neoclassical economics would define as monopolistic. Clearly, an industry with one firm, what neoclassical theory would call a monopoly, it's not consistent with perfect competition. Yet, it is the only outcome a Marshallian can expect to emerge in a decreasing costs industry. With this two-pronged criticism in mind, Sraffa concludes that only a constant costs theory of supply is consistent with Marshallian axioms. Sraffa's critique of Marshall in the 1920s was only the beginning of a much larger project he worked towards for the rest of his life. That is, the building of an alternative framework for economic analysis inspired by the classical tradition of David Ricardo. That project came to its fullest fruition with the publication of Sraffa's magnum opus in 1960. That book, Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities, has been foundational for the modern revival of classical economics. That concludes this talk on Sraffa's critique of Marshall. Thank you to Gary Mongiovi for writing an excellent paper on this topic and for walking me through it. You can read that paper by clicking the link in the description below. If you'd like to get in contact with me, either for tutoring or just to speak about topics in economics, please fill out the form linked in the description of this talk. See you in the next one.